Steve Paulson, how are you?
Okay. Good morning.
Morning.
Welcome to this event on the future of urban transit. I'm Howard Husock. I'm a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm lucky to have an esteemed panel with us here today. I'll introduce them shortly. First, some background and why we're doing this event. It's no secret that the COVID pandemic transformed American life in any number of ways, but one of those includes the extent to which major city commuters use mass transit. Subways, buses, commuter rail. The change was fueled at first, obviously, by lockdowns, but strongly reinforced by new commuter preferences. The drop in transit ridership is striking, at one point falling 71% nationwide. Major American cities have historically relied on mass transit, public transit systems to reduce traffic congestion and enable residents to get to work. But after the COVID-19 pandemic, transit ridership dropped, as I said, to at 1.71%. In New York, it has stultified at 70% of pre-pandemic levels. 3.2 compared to 5.5. I'm not sure that's the latest figure. I have a New York expert here who will tell me in a minute. Big city systems like New York, Washington, Boston, and Philadelphia all depend on fare box revenues, the prices paid by passengers. Thus, the continuing low ridership has serious fiscal implications for these systems. The Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, we're here in Washington, projects a deficit of $750 million by fiscal year 2025. That's a rounding error in New York, but it's big money here. And in New York, the Metropolitan Transit Authority's deficit, that's the largest subway system in the country, may reach $3 billion by 2025. This morning, we'll explore the question of how these systems can or even should sustain their operations and their finances, why doing so matters. What strategies might they themselves pursue to retain and attract riders? Should they receive taxpayer assistance? We'll discuss these and related questions with a group of transit scholars and a longtime transit system leader. On my right, to begin, Andy Byford is the former head of the New York City Transit Authority and has held similar posts in London and Toronto. He currently leads high-speed rail initiatives at Amtrak. I should note, I traveled here from New York on Amtrak's, I said it was a high-speed rail service. He corrected me. He says it's higher speed, but it's not proper high speed. Some of us who live in New York wish Andy were back at the helm of the MTA, but I have a guess that he may not wish that. I don't want to speak for him, though. To Andy's right is Nicole Gelinas. She's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, longtime and greatly valued colleague of mine during my own tenure there, and an incisive and continuing observer about New York City transit, often for the New York Post, where she writes a weekly column. She is at work on a book for Fordham University Press on the post-war history of New York transportation broadly, including mass transit. Steve Paulson is a research professor at the School of Sustainable Engineering and the Built Environment at Arizona State University. Previously served as a senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary for Research and Technology at the Federal Department of Transportation. And then David Zipper. He must get tired of being last with a Z name, but I'm sorry I did that to you. Okay. Is a senior fellow at the MIT Mobility Initiative. He previously worked as the director of business development strategy under two mayors in Washington, D.C., and as executive director of NYC Business Solutions in New York City under Mayor Michael Bloomberg, where a lot of transit initiatives were undertaken. Let me begin with you, Andy Byford. If I could do a thought experiment and put you back at the helm of either Toronto or New York, and I asked you to diagnose the causes of this drop in ridership, what would you have to say?
Well, Howard, I mean, let me just say, first of all, it's not unique to North America. My last job was Commissioner of Transport for London, which is the UK's largest transport system. And when I turned up in 2020 to head up TfL faced the exact same dilemma that New York City Transit, Boston, Philly, all the other systems faced, in that the ridership had collapsed. The revenue, of course, thereby collapsed. And we were faced with this, I'm going to use the word existential crisis, whereby suddenly the whole business model had fundamentally changed pretty much overnight. And it was quite a surreal feeling, actually, to walk through the streets of London, but then also to use the tube, for which the ridership in London dropped to levels of ridership not seen since Victorian times. Wow. It's just, that really, to me, that sums it up. So it was quite striking, and that caused a real problem for TfL. So in many ways, I was living the same life heading up TfL as I would have been had I stayed at New York City Transit. The challenge was the same in that we were suddenly faced with this absolutely catastrophic collapse in ridership and revenues. So in the short term, there was only one option, and that was to seek funding from central government in the way that the MTA made a case and is still making a case to get funding from the state. So for TfL, we had to go almost cap in hand to central government, which was not easy because central government, one, had lots of calls on the exchequer. It was the problem wasn't unique to transit. The NHS, the National Health System, was desperate for funds. Various airlines wanted to be bailed out. Shops were in free fall. Pubs. Everything was suffering from the fact that the demographic had, and the people behaviours had completely changed. But we had to go, as I say, cap in hand. And the second reason it wasn't easy, and this did remind me of my time in New York, I found myself caught between a central government and a mayor who were not on best terms, shall we say. That there was a real tension between the current incumbent of City Hall, Sadiq Khan, and the former incumbent of City Hall, which was the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson. So I had to, it was a very tricky job to navigate getting funding for a big entity like TfL, where perhaps the government wasn't minded to support that enterprise for various reasons, but we made the case that it had to be done, and we secured £6 billion in the process.
And congratulations on that. And if I might, that was almost 5 years ago.
Yeah.
If I might, why has the situation, not as extreme, but why has it persisted? That's my question.
Because it had persisted, because and at that point, the reason I was making that point was at the time we thought we'll just need this one-time infusion and then we get back on our feet. Yeah. Well, that wasn't the case, and it's not the case over here. The ridership in London has recovered to a slightly more than New York, but around 80%. Now, that's not universal. It's the same in New York. Nighttime ridership is pretty strong. Off-peak ridership is pretty strong, but the reason is because the behaviour of particularly office workers has changed to a much more Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday model, lots of home working. So the actual, the previous ridership upon which you could depend without any concerns whatsoever, namely this almost lemming-like rush into the city in the morning and the same back out in the evening, that has changed. And I would suggest that I think that has changed for the very long term now. You might see some still incremental improvement, but I think the genie's out of the bottle. People are now working differently. I don't see that changing in the medium to long term, and therefore transport authorities have to react to that and change their funding accordingly.
So you're affirming what a lot of people think. Nicole, is that what's driving the persistent lower ridership in New York?
Yes, it is people who have a choice every day, do I get on the transit system or not, that for at least a couple of those days every week are making the choice not to get on the transit system because they're working at home Monday and Friday, sometimes another one of the 5 days a week, so they're off the transit system for those 6 rides round trip. And just like the subway strike in 1980 changed some people's behavior, some people got on their bicycles and never got off.
Started wearing sneakers to work.
Yes, and some people got on their bicycles and never got off. COVID also changed people's behavior. You had people start to get used to riding their bicycle to get to work or to perform everyday chores. That's some level of marginal ridership that has not come back. One thing that we saw early in the COVID pandemic that has also persisted is ridership came back much more quickly on the bus system than it did on the subway system. So In April 2020, subway ridership was 5 to 7% of normal. We only had 500,000 people riding the New York City subways every day, historically low amount. We actually had more people riding the bus system. We had a little bit more than 500,000 people riding the bus system every day. Why is that? Partly because the city temporarily made the buses free because the bus drivers didn't want to go near the passengers, so the passengers got on in the back door. But also partly because the people riding the bus disproportionately didn't have a choice whether to go to work or not. You know, these were your supermarket clerks, your home health aides, your hospital workers getting on the bus every single day, March and April 2020. And across the country, transit systems that rely primarily on bus ridership have recovered much more quickly. So you look at San Francisco, for example, BART ridership fell by 94%. Because these were tech workers, these were white-collar workers, it fled the city and fled the transit system in 2020, have come back much, much more slowly compared to the people who are taking the bus system in Oakland, the bus system in Alameda County. That ridership never went below 42% of normal, recovered more quickly. Houston, you don't really think of Houston as a transit city, but they do have an extensive functional bus system. The bus system recovered much more quickly relative to other national mass transit systems. So that's also something to think about, is not only how to convince people who are working at home twice a week to get back on the system, because I think Andy's right, we're never going to get back to a 5-day-a-week commuting week, but how to provide a better service for people who have no choice but to take transit and who never fled the transit system, but are still stuck on buses that move slowly through traffic, and also a transit system that has declined in quality of life as the people with discretion are still staying off it.
Well, just pressure on quality of life before I move on, and I'm hearing crime between the lines there.
Well, yes. I mean, we saw the level of felonies go up 45% on national transit systems in the first 2 years after COVID, has fallen, but has not fallen back to pre-COVID levels. So this is partly why, if you have a choice, some days you don't get on the transit system because passengers do have to contend with more open-air drug use, more disorderly behavior, and a heightened risk of violent crime. But for people who have no choice but to use the transit system, including late at night, early mornings, I think these transit systems nationwide, and particularly in New York City, we had a transit system that was an emblem of an orderly urban environment that was safe for everybody. One of the reasons homeless people slept on the transit system rather than go into the shelter system was that they felt that the subway system was safer to sleep on at night. That public safety situation changed very quickly, where we went from having 1 or 2 homicides on the subway system every year for 25 years to having 33 homicides on the subway system since March of 2020 until last week, where we had our second homicide of 2024. So public disorder and violent crime. Another marginal issue, meaning if I've got a choice today, that nudges me to staying off the system, and if I don't have a choice, it harms people who have to get on these subway systems and contend with a disorder that just didn't exist 4.5 years ago.
Comports with Andy's point that late night and off-peak actually is steady, which is interesting. David, if I might turn to you, and I'm not dissing you, Steve, don't worry, but I'm struck by the fact that you have an interest in transit and business development. And I wonder if you could tell us, we hear this moderately bleak tale if we compare to the status quo ante. Why should we care about this? And why should anybody who doesn't live in these cities care about all of this?
Well, I think there's any number of reasons. And a lot of what I can share with you along these lines draws from a sort of deep dive article I wrote in Vox about how to save public transit from a downward spiral last spring. And I still believe the argument that I put forward there, which is basically it's in all of our interests, whether you take transit or not, to ensure that transit services can survive and be strong. And that really requires investing in service quality right now and avoiding distractions. So when you ask, Howard, like, why should we care about transit? It's a line I would quote if I could remember who it was who said it exactly, but I think it's on point, saying even if you live in a big city, even if you don't rely on transit, someone you rely on does. Mm-hmm. And that might be somebody who is stocking the grocery store, it might be someone who does your dry cleaning, it might be somebody who is cleaning out the dirty linens at the hospital. But if those people can't get to their job, your life is not going to work. And for that reason, all of us need to see transit survive if we believe in the future of some of the greatest American cities. But I think to go beyond that and to think why has transit been able to build a coalition in the U.S. to support public investment over the last 60 plus years, ever since the private companies really went away, the private transit companies, I mean. If you look at it, it really was a coalition of entities that basically believe that even if I don't myself use transit, I get something from it, because not just the quality of life thing of urban life I just mentioned, but because fewer people will drive. That means there will be more economic development. It means there'll be less congestion. More recently, maybe it means there'll be less pollution.
Why more economic development? Because fewer people are driving.
Why? Because it means that you have a wider labor pool. Employers based in the center city can draw from a larger area, which is an argument that I wish that some transit advocates would talk more about, because I think it's very compelling. And that's why here in Washington, the Federal City Council was a big believer in setting up Metro Rail back in the 60s and 70s. It was a huge impetus here, the private sector behind getting rail built here in the nation's capital. But all those arguments are predicated on the idea that fewer people will drive. And that I think is really essential. And I would actually push back against something Nicole was saying, where she says there's people who have no choice, so that they're stuck riding transit. I think and you didn't say that exactly, I'm sorry, but I think that we need to be careful about assuming that the people who use transit, or there's a large swath of people who are just going to be stuck doing so, even because they have low income. Most people, if you talk to them who are transit riders with low incomes, they could find another way to travel. They could get somebody to carpool with them. They could borrow somebody's car. They might use a bike even though they don't want to. So I think it's important to keep in mind that there's a lot more choice going on in whether to use transit or not than we may believe.
Today, especially.
Yeah, today as well. I think always. I think that we need to be careful about this idea of captive riders. I think that's a really insidious notion. But now I think the question is, how can we provide transit services that provide the most compelling value proposition for people not to drive? Not only because it's the right thing to do for economic growth and climate change and so forth and so on, but because that's the best way of helping transit services actually recover, build ridership. It means tilting services away from the peaks that have fallen toward off-peak travel. It's interesting seeing that, and we talked about, and you're right, BART ridership is way down, this commuter rail network.
That's the San Francisco system.
In the Bay Area, right? But interestingly, I was just talking with Jeffrey Tumlin, who leads MUNI, or SFMTA, which is the municipal transit system.
Is a competing streetcar service in San Francisco.
But interestingly, they have actually exceeded, they're over 100% back on ridership for the handful of major lines that never touch the financial district, never touch downtown San Francisco. So it is possible to actually to rebuild ridership, to come out strong, but we have to find ways to create a value proposition for transit services that are strong compared to driving. I guess I'll pause there.
Yeah, and so I'll just kind of summarize what was in my head in these questions. I wanted to talk about the causes, which Andy and Nicole talked about. I wanted to talk about why we should care, and David just made a rather impassioned set of statements about why we should care. Now let's talk about cures, and David has moved us in that direction. So I want to go to Steve, and I think people would be, I'd love to get a sense of how this looks from the federal level, since you were at that level, at that perch. And I think most people would be surprised to know that federal operating assistance does not go to the major metropolitan transit systems. And why is that? Should that change? Should that be part of the cure?
A couple of things. Historically, you're correct, it didn't go directly to operations, but there are elements of operations like maintenance and certainly the paratransit side that could use federal money to support those services. The COVID relief money was available for operating subsidy, and that was a massive amount of money, far in excess of the foregone fares during the time period of COVID and continuing through today. So there has been significant federal investment into operations. There's a number of kind of ways to look at the situation that we're in right now. If we're 20 to 30% down in transit ridership, that means 20 to 30% of the people found better ways to carry out the activities that they used to rely on transit for. And from a policy perspective, is there something wrong with that? Some of them are telecommuting, teleworking. Some of them are doing e-commerce trips or doing other things. Some are using ride-hail services, biking, walking,
Right. So should we even try to fix this, is what you're saying?
So the issue is, we're at a new reality. Transit ridership in the U.S. peaked in 2014. And how does the industry adapt to this new reality, to this bigger set of choices, to changing demographics, to changing behaviors in a way that still sustains kind of the core fundamental goals of public transit? Certainly providing mobility for those people in need is one of those key goals. It's a goal that's got broad political support across the spectrum. And the other key goal has been to provide a resource-efficient movement of people. And that's one that transit's challenged on right now because it really depends on high volumes of activity to utilize those services. And frankly, running empty transit services or not highly filled transit services isn't energy and resource efficient. It isn't financially efficient. So that's the box. So the transit industry really is in a position of figuring out how do we move forward in a world that is different than what we're used to. And it's different for a lot of reasons. COVID kind of highlighted some of those and accelerated some trends. But again, transit ridership peaked in 2014. We've been on a downward slope for a number of reasons. The big transit markets are areas that are declining in population for the most part. Chicago and New York together comprise about 70% of the transit ridership in the US right now, and both of those have had declining urban populations. The growth areas are areas that don't have as much transit and aren't as transit friendly. So the industry really has to sort through this issue and figure out what's the best path forward. Not only how do we fund it, but what's worth funding, what strategies make sense, and how do we compete in a different world than previously existed. And I really encourage the industry to do that. You know, there's been a lot of reluctance of when are things going to return to normal. They're not. Deal with it, find strategies that work going forward.
And so I want to get back to whether there's an equivalent to going cap in hand. I just stole your Britishism there. To get money from Washington to sustain these systems and to just fix it that way. Is that what you would be doing if you were back at the MTA? Or is adjusting, as Steve suggests, implies something else?
No, I think it needs to be more sophisticated than just going with a begging bowl to just say that we want to maintain the status quo of doing everything we've always done. We're still going to do it the same way with the same resources, the same practices and processes, but you've got to bail us out. I think that's an unsophisticated and probably ultimately futile argument. So I think it's incumbent upon all transit systems, and I see this happening. It's certainly something we were doing at TfL. I see the MTA doing it now. One, to look at your cost model to see where there are efficiencies that can be derived and things that can now and should be contemplated in this new changed dynamic. In the fact that there is this new paradigm, a completely new and enduring, I think, ridership model that means that do nothing is not an option. So one, have a look at your cost base. Two, make your offer, your service offer, as attractive as it can be. I agree with Nicole. It's got to be safe, it's got to be clean, it's got to be reliable, it's got to be quick, so prioritize transit, etc. And then three, look at potentially new ways or a new business model, such as looking to more than ever diversify, exploit air rights. It's something that Hong Kong does very well. It's something that London has done with the Elizabeth line, where the Elizabeth line stations were constructed in central London. They were deliberately constructed so that you can build big tower blocks above those stations and thereby provide an on-stream of revenue. So I think those are the three building blocks for me. Look for ways to minimize your costs, maximize your income, and make your offer as attractive as possible to both retain those people who have come back and to see if you can incrementally add an extra 5%, because that will make a huge difference.
Well, let's drill down on each of those points. And Nicole, you've written a lot about management efficiencies and costs in New York, and I'm sure Andy could fill in some of those details from brutal experience. But it's one thing to talk about the value proposition. It's another thing to talk about efficiencies. Where are the efficiencies hidden that could be exploited, could be dealt with?
Right. Ironically, as the transit system is struggling with less revenue, it actually has to provide a better service than it did before. And I'll give you one example, is the commuter rail. So before 2020, the commuter rail into New York from the northern suburbs had many express trains every day. So you could get on the train, be in Grand Central in half an hour, 40 minutes or so. The MTA cut back on the express trains because it kind of thinks, well, there's fewer people riding the express. We can have a train every hour instead of every half hour. Everyone can pile onto that train. But if you are thinking, do I want to come into the Manhattan office today or go see a show in Manhattan today? And it's an hour and 10-minute ride instead of a 35, 40-minute ride, and the train's going to be more crowded. That's one of the things that is nudging you not to make the decision to come into Manhattan that day. It is a false efficiency. For 60 years, from the post-war era until 2019, the New York City state could look at, in the real estate industry, which depends on people coming into Manhattan, could look at mass transit as a public utility. Yes, you have to provide some level of predictable, reliable, safe service, but it doesn't have to be that great. You get to a basic level and people have no choice but to take it. If you want a high-paying job in your field, you are going to be in Manhattan. If you want to come to Manhattan, you are going to be on the transit system. There are not a lot of choices to be made there. So today, it's really not a public utility. It has to be an amenity for a lot of people. It has to be, if not the highlight of their day, something that they know nothing is going to go wrong. People just will not put up with the level of delays and unpredictability that they put up with in 2017, the year of the summer of hell for the New York transit system. People still got on the transit system because most of them just didn't have a choice. You came in Mondays and Fridays to your office. You didn't tell your boss, I'm going to stay at home. That would have seemed absurd at the time. So it's a long way of saying actually have to provide better service with less revenue. How do you do that? The good news is there is time to adjust the costs. You don't have to have mass scale cost reductions and layoffs and drastic changes, but you have to use that time. Otherwise, you will come to a point where you have to threaten layoffs and drastic service cuts. What can you do to achieve efficiencies? One of the most important things is just political will from the New York State and city government to achieve even modest changes in work rules to the union contracts, to just have the labor force more in line with providing the service that the public wants. I'll give you an example. On the New York City subway trains, you have two people on every single train, a person, the train operator, and the conductor. That's fine. You've got 1,500 people on trains. You want to have a human presence on the trains for evacuations and so forth. But As we go to digital signaling, you don't need a person to operate the train. So what could that person be doing? Could be scanning full camera coverage of every single car, calling in any problems on a particular car so they can be dealt with at the next station. You could have a person trained differently and their job would be slightly different to walk through the train now that we're going to trains without doors in between the cars, make sure everything on the train is okay. In other words, you can still have two people on the train or maybe at some point one person on the train, but they are doing something that the public wants more of,
So we're
which
talking
is assuring
reimagination rather than brutal
yeah, you don't have
efficiencies.
to massively cut the labor force, but can the labor force be gradually doing the jobs more in line with what the public wants to see from today's transit system? You can do that gradually, but you have to start doing it. You can't keep signing 3 to 5 year labor contracts with no changes to the work rules at all.
And so you're echoing Andy's point, which is we can't keep doing the same thing and say, give us more money. But David, I would love it if I could ask you, I know everybody in the world is interested in New York, but you actually have experience advising Washington Metro. And do the kind of things that Nicole is talking about in New York resonate here in Washington? Is it the same kind of challenge or a different one?
First, I should clarify, I'm not an advisor to Washington.
No, but you have been, or you have
Yeah.
been familiar with it.
I am familiar with Metro and with some other systems around the country, for sure. Yeah, New York City is something of in many ways, it's something of an anomaly in this country. I would say a couple things. One big sort of post-COVID change, which I don't think that we've really grappled with as a country, because it affects so many transit systems around the country, is just how all the ramifications of the flattened peak.
Of the what?
The flattened rush hour peak.
Uh-huh.
The fact that transit trips, relatively speaking, are taking place more on the weekends, more during the day or at night, and relatively fewer at, say, like, especially at the peak of the peak, at like 8 a.m. or 5 p.m., when pre-COVID, you would expect that's when you have the absolute most people boarding transit and also, frankly, driving on highways. And we basically built our urban transportation systems to a large extent to accommodate that peak of the peak.
Including the labor contracts.
Including the labor contracts, but that's yes, that's true. That is a piece of the puzzle, but I'm actually thinking more about the capital of transit in this way, because if you're buying your rolling stock such that you can basically deploy everything at the peak of the peak, that means it's sort of sitting idle for a lot of the rest of the day, or maybe it's not fully deployed. And that's why, by the way, you end up seeing a lot of those buses that you might see at 2 p.m. with like 3 people on them, and it's so inefficient. Well, not really necessarily. If the system basically bought all those buses because they've got to be using them at 5:30 p.m., it might be relatively efficient to go ahead and stick it out there at 2 o'clock, because otherwise it'd be sitting in a yard somewhere. But the broader point in terms, and this is an issue that, by the way, is nationwide. It's actually also relevant in Europe too, because everybody is seeing this relative decline in peak travel. What that means is that there's less need for capital expenditures on new buses and trains, I would argue, because what a lot of agencies already have is enough, because the peak is a little bit lower. So maybe that means there's relatively more of a focus on maintenance. There's also less of and you're right, Howard, it has big labor implications, because it's very hard to efficiently staff peak of the peak routes, which we could go into. But the point is, particularly on the capital side, there's a disconnect, I would argue, between how the U.S. has traditionally funded transit, which is to have the federal government support capital and not operations, when what the systems really need right now is operations support. Capital, relatively speaking, is not as much of a pain point, I would suggest, as it might have been 10 years ago, because of the relative shift in how Americans are traveling. And that is a point that is relevant, I would argue, nationwide.
Steve, I'd love to get your view on that, especially on the idea, if the federal bucket of aid is historically focused on capital reliably. I understand that during the pandemic there were bailouts, if you will. But if the default is, the legislative default, the authorization has always been on capital, thinking that's the toughest nut to crack for these local systems. And if, as David is saying, maybe they don't need that as much, is there any imaginable way to rejigger that blood supply?
There certainly is, and the Congressional Research Service recently did a report that looked at capital versus operating and some scenarios going forward. There's always been a political reluctance to thinking that the locals should be responsible for the operations of the system. The vast majority of transit trips are local trips serving local needs. Historically, federal money has tried to focus on things that have, quote, national interest. Now, obviously, you can define national interest in a lot of different ways, but that was certainly historically the logic that the locals should be responsible for that. I do tend to agree that the capital needs are potentially different going forward. Partly is the peaking. The other challenge we've had is the capital, particularly in transit, a lot of it's been discretionary funding. So it's in effect free money and net new money for local areas. So they compete for it vigorously and try and leverage it and to build things. And it tends to create an interest in sometimes grandiose projects or projects that they might not be willing to do on their own, but they're willing to do with somebody else's money. You could revert
Fixed rail systems in St. Louis.
Exactly. Fixed rail systems, every place that's big enough to argue that they deserve one. There's a lot to keep up with the Joneses.
Sorry to single out St. Louis, but I did ride the transit system. I was the only one in the station. It was not happy time.
We went through an era where, every emerging major city wanted to have one like Portland, like Dallas, like whatever, and there was an awful lot of that going on, and that discretionary money kind of induced that behavior. We could certainly have a formula that would allocate federal resources based on passenger miles of service or something like that, that accomplished that purpose if there was a political will to do that. There is a strong temptation to argue that, is that a federal role? During COVID, we had an emergency situation. Nobody was paying attention to budget deficits or pay-fors in terms of federal funding. We may or may not, depending on what happens politically, be in an era where the willingness to incur additional debt, to ask what will be our kids and grandkids to pay for operating subsidies in today's cities, there may be some pushback on that and some reluctance to do that. There's also a little bit of a sense that the cities own some of the problems and situations, and you can talk about the crime situation, for instance. It is a huge deterrent to transit ridership. There's people that are less comfortable using transit if there's people that are prone to violence or mental health issues or homelessness, et cetera, and that does deter ridership, and that's been borne out in research and certainly in anecdotal information and observation. And so that's an issue. And there's a little bit of a challenge of asking people across the country to subsidize operations in the city because fares are low because they choose not to enforce laws. So there's some pushback politically on some of those things.
Fare beaters you're talking about?
Well, fare beaters and the criminal
people
activities.
are avoiding the system because of
if you're not enforcing crimes in certain cities and there's crime that's deterring transit ridership, so we should subsidize that. Cities lost transit fare revenue because they're, and so there's some cause and effect things, and there's going to be some pushback and some sensitivity. How that plays out remains to be seen. There's certainly, there continues to be strong kind of core support for public transportation. People want to see, they value the mobility, they recognize the value of the system, but the money's got to come from somewhere. So there's got to be we've gotten away with the federal dollars because it's kind of like, it's not perceived as significant. We haven't historically had to have pay-fors like we do with local or state money. Going forward, if we're continue to be in that situation where we simply put it on the deficit, then it'll have strong political support to do it if there's a willingness to put it on the deficit. If you come back and say, okay, well, what are we going to cut to pay for this, or what taxes are we going to raise to pay for this, then we'll see a little different discussion going forward.
I'm fascinated by David's point that we don't need as much rolling stock or buses, and we have to maybe rethink that. Andy, does that suggest that aid that does come from higher levels of government should be just in one bucket and let the transit agencies decide how to allocate it? Would you be happy with that as a chief executive?
I think the main thing that you want as a chief executive of any transit authority is you want certainty in your funding. What kills you, what makes it really, really difficult is short-term, stop-start, famine, feast budgetary cycles. It's really difficult. So I always used to say it's very, very difficult to run New York City Transit or TfL for that matter if year on year, and in some cases, like every 6 months, you do not know what your budget is going to look like. It's inherently inefficient. If, for example, you were looking to undertake a major capital investment, then you want certainty that the money is authorized. You want certainty that a change in regime isn't going to suddenly make you put a stop on that investment. Because one of the phenomena that you regularly see is if you can't provide certainty to contractors, guess what contractors do? They elevate the price because they factor in the risk that you might pull the plug on them. So you've got to, as a CEO of a transit organization, it's not unique to transit, but I think it's particularly strongly felt. You've got to have that certainty of income such that you can plan with confidence. I always used to say to my political bosses, tell me the outputs, let me deliver the inputs. So set the parameters, you can hold me to account for those high-level goals, you can tell me what it is that you're paying for, so give me 5 years worth of funding, ideally 10, but I'll take 5. 5 years worth of funding, and you, because you provided that funding, you can then determine what outputs you want from that funding, and you can sack me if I don't deliver on them. But the quid pro quo is, leave it me alone to then determine the strategy and the tactics to deliver against that. I will deliver on it, we will deliver on it, but we've got to then be left alone to execute. And so my view would be it's more about the certainty of funding than the allocation between CapEx and OpEx.
Well, I got to follow up. What would you be held accountable for? What would the ideal outputs be?
Well, I mean, you typically operate across a whole range of outputs. So typically you have a balanced scorecard in terms of operational outputs, the number of passengers that you're going to carry, the amount of mileage that you're going to deliver, the cost of operations, the available seat indices. There's a whole spectrum of customer satisfaction. There's a whole spectrum of measures against which transit authorities can and should be and are measured. And so typically you would manage against a whole basket of measures. But for that, you need to have adequate funding.
And speaking of adequate funding, are fares set in the right way? If fare box revenue is, what's fare box revenue in New York, Nicole, as a percentage?
It was close to half. Now it's closer to 33%.
Yeah. So it's a vital input. Should we be charging more? If people really need this service, and it's as vital as David says it is to the economy of cities, are we? I mean, there's a cry for free transit. The mayor of Boston has campaigned on free transit. So what's the sweet spot here? Could we charge more? Should we charge less?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
I don't think we should begin the conversation of we're not charging enough for transit. I don't think that's the problem.
Well, I'm going to elasticity here.
We
though.
have.
If you charge more, you might get more.
Well, if you charge more, you might get fewer riders. And it's a complex environment right now when thinking about fare strategy because you have the monthly passes, where your 5-day week pre-COVID commuters on the subway and on commuter rail would pay $132 for a subway pass and $250 to $450 for the monthly commuter rail pass. And that was a big stream of predictable revenue for the MTA, and much of that has gone away because if you're commuting from Austining, you're not buying that monthly pass
It's a
anymore.
suburban place in New York. I'm just subtitling here. Yeah.
You're buying your tickets as you go, and you're choosing to buy an off-peak ticket because you don't need to be there at 8:30 a.m. anymore. So to say to people who are already have noticed, I'm saving a lot of money every month by not buying that monthly pass, and to go to them and say, now that you're back on the system 3 days a week, we're going to reward you by charging more for the off-peak ride, and you're sending them to making the different decision on the subway system. We've got a $2.90 fare now. Would you really want to think about raising that to $3.50 or $4?
Let's phrase it not as should we suck it to these guys, but is there any creativity that can be applied to the fare structure? When I ride the subway in New York, I pay a flat fee no matter how far I go. When I do it in Washington, it's keyed to distance. David, is there some creativity in how we set the fares that we should be thinking about as part of this new open-mindedness that you're urging on us?
This could go in any number of different directions. What I'll say in terms of fare policy, I don't know if this counts as innovative anymore because more systems are adopting it, but I think fare capping has been a really positive step forward. Fare capping. Capping, C with the C, fare capping.
Yeah.
So like Omni has it in New York, TriMet in Portland, Oregon really, I think was the first to go down that path, I believe. I've been doing some stuff with the Jacksonville Transportation Authority, which is adopting it. I think it's great. For those who don't know fare capping, basically the idea behind it is that you have to have individual-based accounts, often with mobile ticketing. But the idea is that there's some people who have low incomes who ride transit who won't be able to pay upfront the cost of, say, a monthly pass. So they'll be swiping for individual trips, and they can end up actually paying more over the course of a month than what that monthly pass would have cost.
It's like buying the economy size rather than the giant size.
Yeah, so the idea is, well, let's not penalize such people who don't have the money up front or may not be able to do the math or whatever to figure out what the best ticket is for them. So basically, if the monthly pass is, I'm just picking numbers out of the air, if the monthly pass is $50 and a individual trip is $2, once you take 25 trips, you've paid $50, so your 51st, 52nd, 53rd are all free. You're not going to be charged for that. I like this idea because I think it's potentially progressive. I think it's the right thing to do. It feels appropriate. The studies that I have seen about it are relatively limited, but suggest that it does encourage more ridership. It does require having individual-based ticketing. It won't work if you're paying with cash. So that's a bit of a wrinkle. But I think this is, if you're asking about innovations in fare policy, I think this is one that I think I'd like to see further expand because it seems like it's not going to solve all our issues, to be clear, but I think it's the right thing to do.
Isn't that going to reduce revenue?
That's a great question, and that's actually what the Jacksonville this is what JT and I were looking at. It may or may not, because the individual may end up not paying for that 51st, 52nd, 53rd ticket. But on the other hand, the fact that they now have more certainty of how much they're going to be paying in a month for transit could induce more people to ride. So it's not clear.
So they get to 50 rather than stopping at 40.
Yeah, it could be that. It could be that that other people end up riding because they realize like, oh, this is I sort of have like a backstop that system is taking care of me. You asked the right question, Howard. I've never seen a study that looks at that. And in fact, this is part of what I was saying with Jacksonville. They're going to be collaborating with some academics to study exactly that point, to understand what the financial impact is of fare capping. Because to be honest with you, I don't think we totally know yet. Maybe Nicole knows if there's been a good study with Omni about it, but I've not seen it if it exists.
But I'm gathering, I'll do the show of hands like they do in presidential debates. I'm gathering nobody on the stage is in favor of free transit.
Free transit. Oh, if you want, yeah.
It's all about choices. I mean, to me, it's and you've made the point about elasticity. Elasticity, there is a tipping point. If you charge people too much, then they will be deterred from using transit. If you want, you could make the transit system free. You've got to watch for unintended consequences, though. What do I mean by that? That you've got to think through. So you're not now getting revenue, so you can just enter. There's no implied contract with the customer. So will you inadvertently introduce a much less controlled environment? Will you be a victim of your own success in having way more people than you thought you were going to? But you could have it. It's all about choices, though, because if you're giving free transport and thereby you don't get the revenue that you would have got, that has to be paid for somewhere. So it needs to do that would need political courage and would need a very careful thought through about what the choice is in order to pay for that.
I'm fascinated. You implied there's a public order dimension to paying.
I think my personal view is I think that not with everyone clearly, but if you're in an environment where you have paid for a ticket, you have certain expectations, and I think that to a certain extent engenders certain behaviours amongst the majority of people because there's this implied contract, and in fact there is actually a contract between yourself and the transport provider. They'll get you from A to B, you behave in a certain way and you follow the rules. If it's a free system, I think that you're in danger of putting that at risk.
Interesting. Steve, we're hearing some good suggestions about reliability, about fare innovation. What are some of the mistakes that we should avoid?
You have a couple hours? Well, there's a couple things. Let me comment on fares first. With our new technologies, it gives us some freedom and some opportunities to do some innovative things with fare collection, like the fare capping, like third-party payment strategies are easier. I tend to think that, if the service provides the value, the customer should pay for it. And most of the research shows that customers want quality of service as a priority relative to lower fares. That's relatively convincing in terms of the research findings. I find it a little bit intriguing that New York might be reluctant to raise fares, but they're going to do a congestion charge that's something like $15 a day. So there is this issue of, if these impede activity, et cetera, does that apply across the spectrum? We don't seem to be reluctant to raise tolls and
Steve's
and
referring
those
to
kinds of
congestion
things.
pricing coming to New York as it's come to London,
Yes,
where
yeah.
those who go south at a certain cross street in Manhattan would pay a $15 driving fee. This is for cars. And the idea that it would cross-subsidize, we should talk about that. But let's talk about that. You promised to entertain us with mistakes we should avoid.
Another quick thing on fares. In the U.S., we have, in effect, half-price fares for people over 65. I don't think I deserve half-price fares or need that subsidy.
I object.
Run for office on that one.
It's an anachronism to an era where that was highly correlated with income. It's
In
less
Britain,
so
they
today.
call them super agers, I believe.
Yeah.
I like that better.
The world is so different right now, and different contexts are so different. We just need to be real careful about trying to prescribe a solution that we think is a national solution or a national strategy. The areas are different in terms of their workforce, pace of recovery, attitude toward transit, availability of alternatives, congestion, culture, political will, crime, etc. And we're seeing more variation than we've ever seen in terms of the nature of transportation problems across geography. So we really need to customize solutions. I hope folks take take advantage of the kind of post-COVID era to break some eggs and try some different solutions than they have in the past. That we really need to do some experimentation, and we need to be careful thinking that the solution is to return things to the way they were, or that even expanding transit is necessarily a critical need.
That's
People
interesting. So
have alternatives.
for cities that don't have it, that may be a cautionary. David, I'm going to get back to Nicole, but David was leaning in on mistakes.
Oh, I just think there's a great example of what not to do. It's just a few blocks away from here. Some of you might remember the debate over what to do with K Street last spring when
I think we should make it a lobbyist-free zone.
Yeah, well, yes, and from a transportation perspective, the plan has been to redo K Street, which, by the way, is like it's a terribly designed street. It's very confusing to drive on. It's very dangerous for pedestrians, and the bus line. You have major trunk lines for Metro bus that are very slow there because of the traffic. So the city has planned to invest over $100 million to basically build a dedicated bus lane and build bulb outs for pedestrian safety, build a bike lane a block away. A lot of good stuff, exactly the kinds of things that speed up bus service and thereby, I would argue, bring people back to transit. You create a virtuous cycle instead of the downward spiral we're all afraid of, blah, blah, blah. So last spring, a council member here in the district named Charles Allen has been a big supporter of fare-free transit. Turned out he had to come up with $100 million to support that, which basically would mean that every district resident would not have to pay for any bus trips anymore on Metrobus. And so he said, okay, I've got it. We're just gonna table this whole K Street project and use that $100 million to fund fare-free buses. This created a big political brouhaha between the mayor and council. WMATA stepped in and was like, yeah, they actually, I don't think they were very explicit. They were like, we're not sure this is the best idea. And eventually, for a variety of reasons, it did not go forward. But I just bring this up as a important example of what I think is the hollowness of the arguments put forth by certain fare-free advocates who say we can have both, high-quality service plus free trips. No, there is an inevitable trade-off with what to do with a given dollar. And the district came very close to making what I think would have been a cataclysmic mistake and exactly be in the wrong direction, and I hope other cities will not do the same.
Mistakes, Nicole, to avoid?
I would just say one other creative idea in lieu of free transit.
Okay, we're going to be positive. Okay, everybody's resisting my negativity.
Right, exactly.
That's okay.
Should the bus in some circumstances be cheaper than the heavy rail for systems that have both heavy rail and bus service? So for example, in New York, subway is $2.90. Should the bus be $2.50 or $2 in consideration of the fact that more people on the bus are poorer workers, people who are still going 5 days a week and therefore still paying 5 days a week worth of fares, and the bus service, despite the good progress on bus lanes, is still less efficient than the subway service. So should there be a differential bus fare, that's something to think about, would be much more constructive than the free fare model. The other worrisome issue with free fares is once the bus system or the transit system is free, it is considered by elected officials to be just another government service to be paid out of general tax revenues, and it will be considered a social service. That will be the first thing to be cut back in a budget crisis. If you have a
it
deficit,
more vulnerable.
Right, you're going to cut the transit system before you cut education system, police, fire, sanitation, and so forth. So that's not a good route to go down. But another positive idea.
Well, I'm hearing free fare is universally being viewed as not the right path.
Yeah.
Keep going.
To obtain more conservative and moderate support to subsidize transit service, to make that service better, not to make it cheaper, I think we need to do a better job of couching it as an anti-poverty and a workforce connection policy. So if you are disconnected from the workforce,
This is how to sell it.
yes, you're trying to get back into the workforce, you're looking for a minimum wage job. In most of the country where there is not a reliable transit system, you have to make a big marginal investment in a vehicle to get yourself to your minimum wage job. Average cost of operating a new vehicle every year is more than $12,000. Used vehicle, also several $1,000s a year, all kinds of maintenance costs and in gasoline and in insurance, everything else. You can buy an annual transit pass for around $1,400 in New York City, around $1,000 a year in the rest of the country, $1,000 a year to get you to your work versus $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 a year to drive you to your work. Big difference in the decision of do you join the minimum wage workforce or not? And we saw that in New York. The stations that gained the most ridership over 30 years from 1990 to just before the pandemic were the stations in the South Bronx, were the stations in central Brooklyn, where the workforce participation rate after welfare reform...
Those are the Anacostia equivalents
Yeah,
in New
the
York,
workforce participation rate before welfare reform was 40%. It went up to the U.S.
So this is
average
interesting.
of...
So I'm associated here, and the sponsor of record here is the Center for Opportunity and Social Mobility, and you've just indicated why that is the appropriate
Right.
sponsor.
If you had to buy a car to get a minimum wage job and commuting from the South Bronx, you would have much less success.
What about Uberized bus systems, though, on demand, rather than investing in this fixed service?
That may work in some places, in some circumstances, but to create a bus system from scratch, you're kind of reinventing the wheel. I mean, making the existing bus system better in most places with an existing bus system makes much more sense.
Andy, you were leaning in.
Mistakes. Yeah, two mistakes, slashing service and slashing maintenance expenditure. I would say those are two mistakes, and so many transit systems in the past have fallen into that trap, often under political pressure, but also because sometimes it's seen as a panacea. It's a quick fix. We've got a real budget problem, got a massive red hole in the budget. I know what we'll do. We'll slash service or we'll slash maintenance costs. So often, I'm not saying you don't make any changes. Obviously, you do. That's the challenge. It's about, it's a fine balancing act. But if so often you do that in haste and you regret it at leisure because it's false economy. Why? Slashing service, if you haven't thought it through properly, might that actually have a more detrimental impact upon your bottom line, number one? And number two, if brighter times come around, try turning that service back on quickly. It's difficult if you've got rid of half of your workforce, which can't be just turned on in a flash, or if you've also retired or mothballed or got rid of a whole load of your vehicles. Second phenomenon, slash maintenance spending. Again, always tempting by a CFO who's under pressure. Again, can be real false economy though, because initially, yes, you save some money. Over time, you are building up problems. If you allow your transit system to fall below a state of good repair, and I would argue that New York City is a classic example of that, from the brilliant work that my predecessor David Gunn did in the 80s, if you don't keep up with state of good repair in terms of modernizing signaling systems, keeping track in good order, maintaining facilities, depots, overhead wires if they're there, if you don't do that, you will regret it because ultimately service reliability will degrade, and ridership will thereby be adversely impacted. And secondly, when you come to put it right, invariably it will cost you more than what it would have cost you had you just maintained on a steady, responsible path.
Free consulting service to the Transit Authority here and across the country. So thank you. But David, in your wonderful Vox article, by the way, I should have said that people can send in questions because we're about to come to a Q&A period, and somebody needs to tell me how they send their questions in.
They can send them to my email, sam.owens@aei.org, or they can use our hashtag, which you can find on the event page.
sam.owens@aei.org, or?
They can find the hashtag on the event page on Twitter. Yeah.
There is apparently a hashtag that I couldn't hear.
On Twitter.
On Twitter, that we don't call Twitter.
X.
No one uses Twitter anymore anyway, so.
Okay.
I still call it Twitter.
Sam.owens@aei.org. Send us your questions. and we're about to turn to questions, but in this wonderful Vox article that David Zipper wrote, and I refer you to it, I suppose if you just search on that, you will find it. You talked about a different kind of mistake, which is such kind of false messiahs as let's electrify the whole fleet. And why do you consider that to be a bad idea? It sounds like it's an environmentally sound idea.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I'll get there in 1 second, but I start from the premise that this is an existential moment for transit systems around the country.
Second time existential has been used here, okay.
It's a great word. But we have WMATA facing a $750 million deficit, you mentioned. SEPTA's facing a $240 million deficit.
That's in Philadelphia.
Yes, it is. And you could keep going down the list. So the systems have got to be able to obtain money. And I really appreciate the point that Andy made earlier about the necessity of having reliable funding streams. And given the nature of Congress and the White House potentially changing over, even the transit officials I've spoken to say even if we could get some federal dollars for operations right now, we don't trust we'd have it 2 years from now, which makes it really hard to plan. So that puts a real emphasis on states, on what happens in Harrisburg, what happens in Albany, what happens here in the DMV with funding WMATA, for example. And that means you've got to win over the support from people who are not going to ride transit, who live in suburban Virginia or live in rural Virginia or live in Virginia Beach for that matter. And that comes down to, and this is a point I made earlier, it's all about transit as a way of reducing driving. So even if I'm not using it, I see value from it. That means that it is inducing fewer people to drive, and in so doing, promoting economic development, reducing congestion, and potentially reducing emissions. So that being the case, the focus has to be on service, transit service, because that's how you get more people to ride. That's how you let transit do what it's designed to do, which is provide a viable way of mobility separate from using an automobile. And what I worry is that, now I get back to what your question was, that these well-intentioned unfunded mandates or advocacy pushes around fare-free transit, which we already talked about, or electrification of buses, like California is now requiring transit systems to electrify their buses, I believe by 2040, if I have that right. Those are, I would argue, distractions from transit's core mission right now at that existential moment, third time using it. And I say that because on the electric bus side, first of all, the fare-free side, we already talked about it. It takes money away that systems need. On the electric bus side, there's a lot of evidence coming out that it's very complicated redesigning your bus network to accommodate electric buses. That's been a huge issue in places like Albuquerque. Boston is struggling with it right now. And I question, first of all, given the fact that anybody who's going to take transit, including a diesel belching bus, as opposed to driving, is already doing the planet a favor, why are we focusing on electrification of buses, which comprise a tiny share of overall emissions and a tiny share of the vehicles on the road? Why complicate the already difficult jobs that transit agency leaders have by putting these mandates on them around electrification of buses, which is a nice idea, but to be honest, it shouldn't be, I believe, the top priority right now, and it could end up being counterproductive in achieving the climate goals that a lot of us share.
Okay, we have a question, and I actually know who it's coming from, so I'm going to ask him to state it orally rather than for me to rephrase it. My friend John Bunton is here. He is former deputy mayor of Nashville, and push is coming to shove on a transit initiative there. So here we have a growing city, one of the most dynamic cities in America, that is at a tipping point on transit. So wait for the microphone and tell us.
Thank you for the chance to ask the first question, Howard, and thank you for this panel. This is a really interesting subject. So a little context on Nashville. 6 years ago, the city put a transit initiative before the public. Tennessee and Nashville have a very high sales tax. In Nashville, it's about 9.25%. The public did not find favor with that plan. It was decisively voted down. In part because people didn't really understand the benefits of a very significant sales tax increase. Nashville has a new mayor who is very committed to transit, has been very outspoken in support of
Transit meaning what?
an interesting question. Well, I think transit meaning improving mass transit services.
Fixed rail?
Not fixed rail, probably. We'd be looking more at bus rapid transit, but also just improving WeGo, which is Nashville-Davidson County's bus system. There are also broader transportation needs, of course. Nashville just put into effect a real-time traffic center. There's a lot of coordination work to be done with the state on routes and so forth. Last week, Mayor O'Connell announced another referendum, which will go before voters in November, to fund transit and transportation improvements. Details are lacking at this point, but the commitment has been made to move forward.
So another sales tax referendum.
Another sales tax referendum.
All right, let me ask Steve, how does that strike you? We've got outside the Beltway.
It's fairly typical, particularly with fast-growing cities, oftentimes wanting to, in effect, catch up and add transit to make them, to bring the transit level up to more consistent with peer cities that are more mature than them. You know, cities up and down the street from you, Raleigh and Charlotte and others have gone through similar situations. A couple, and this gets back to one of the mistakes that you mentioned. A lot of folks are still working with pre-COVID planning in terms of public transportation, and that's a mistake. People need to think about public transit in the context of the conditions that exist today, particularly as it relates to that commute market, which has historically been the core market for public transit. About 50% of transit trips are work trips, and if you cut down that information worker share, that makes a big difference. So any plan that exists certainly needs to deal with post-COVID travel realities and behaviors. Certainly not looking at fixed guideway and looking at the adaptability and flexibility of bus rapid transit makes sense for scales that way, or cities of that scale.
But just real quickly, define bus rapid transit for us.
It's basically protected guideway or partially or fully exclusive guideway operation to give the quality of service that you can have with rail, but without all of the infrastructure associated with building rail. That makes sense. It's much more adaptable and flexible. It can evolve incrementally. A bus life is about 12 years, so as propulsion technologies and guidance technologies and things evolve, you can continuously updating it. A rail car.
And what about sales tax as a funding mechanism?
It's the go-to funding source because it grows with inflation and it's spread relatively thin across the community, so people tend to choose that. It's fairly predictable, so that's kind of the gold standard for revenue stream.
And we heard earlier from Nicole, there may be ways to sell it in terms of workforce, and because it sounds like selling it is the hard problem.
Right. Yeah.
Over here, we had another question on the far right here.
My name's Joe Freeman. When I'm not here, I live in Brooklyn, New York, and I've been taking the New York City subway system for over 50 years. I've got two observations I'd like you to address, and I'll give you an example of each of them. One is crime. You raised the issue of more crime. Well, one way to deter crime is to have police walking around seeing and being seen. But whenever I see police in the system, they are clustered in 2s, 3s, and 4s, talking to each other. They are not walking around seeing and being seen. Can you do anything about that? Can anything be done? Second has to do with other kinds of services. The people in a ticket booth is plummeted. And in part because it has plummeted, when I can't get my card to work, I can't put money on my card, something goes wrong with the machinery, there's no one to help me. So what do I do at that point? Well, there's choices. You know, you can break the system and go over the transom. You can leave and walk to another stop to try and find something there. But there aren't any good choices. It strikes me that something could be done. If you're not going to put people back in the booth, isn't there some way you can find to help people who can't make the machinery work?
All right, let's thank you for those two incisive questions. Let's start with the public safety aspect of it. Nicole, in your book, when William Bratton became the head of the transit police, I expect he didn't urge the police to cluster and talk to each other. But that was where he first made his mark in terms of drastically reducing crime in the subways. How did he do it?
Right, and I'm curious to get Andy's thoughts on this as well. So we'll embark on the entirely non-controversial topic of policing. So yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, the crime decline and the disorder decline in the New York City subway system was one of the great turnaround stories of the city, and became a blueprint for the overall citywide crime decline a few years later. So in 1990. We had 26 homicides on the New York City subway system. One of them was a tourist, Brian Watkins, who was traveling with his family to the US Open. That was kind of the watershed homicide where the New York Post ran the headline, "Dave, do something," trying to get Mayor Dinkins to respond more proactively to crime. Mayor actually was doing that already. People forget that David Dinkins actually ran on a law and order platform in 1989 because he was running against Rudy Giuliani, and also because he felt strongly about it himself. With Dinkins' support and with then Governor Mario Cuomo's support, the New York State and City raised property and income taxes, put a surcharge to support policing in the New York City subway system. But that policing was done in a very different manner than it had been done before, where the transit police chief, Bill Bratton, said, "We will stop small crimes in the subway system before they turn into larger crimes." So apprehend people jumping over the fare gate. A disproportionate number of those people had outstanding warrants for arrest on violent crimes, and or they were carrying a gun or a knife into the transit system. So stop them at the fare gate, keep them from off the system before they bring a weapon into the system. You prevent violent crimes that way. The problem is we kind of became a victim of our own success. The system was so safe by 2017, 2018. People no longer supported this type of proactive policing. And as the police kind of reverse again and go back into the system more assertively, because people have become worried about crime in the past few years, they're not being as assertive on a proactive policing basis, partly because their morale is not very good right now. A big part of what Bratton did was improving the morale of the police force by saying what you were doing is important. The city supports what you were doing within certain disciplinary guidelines, of course. The public is behind you. Now, much of the police force feels whatever we do, we're going to be criticized from some angle, whether they are right to think that or not. For many police officers, the safest thing to do, unless pushed by management, is to do absolutely nothing. So kind of oversimplifies it. I mean, they're not doing absolutely nothing. They are still apprehending guns on the transit system and so forth, but could they be doing a much better job of it, and could NYPD commissioner and the mayor be pushing them to act much more assertively in the system? Yes, absolutely.
And I'm guessing you would think that's a blueprint, not just for New York.
Right. We had a homicide on the Chicago transit system recently. Washington has had a couple shootings on the bus system. You keep bad actors off of the system before they get on the system, and you solve a lot of your problems.
Okay, and the other half of the question, and I want to turn to Andy, your thoughts on policing, but also it seemed like the questioner was talking about cutbacks in assistance at the stations, which could fall into your false economy area.
Yes. Okay, so Here's my take on it. As the ex-president of Transit, I used to work very, very closely with the Transit Bureau chief, which was Chief Ed De La Torre. We had a fabulous relationship. I start from a position of very, very, very supportive of NYPD. I think they're fantastic. He is. So he's not the commissioner, but he's the head of the Transit Bureau. So I'm a big supporter of the Blue. I think they do a fabulous job. But like you, it used to drive me nuts when I would go onto a station and see a clump or a cluster of NYPD officers when if they just spread out through the station, and fine, patrol in pairs, that's fine, then you could provide a much greater deterrent to would-be villains and a reassurance to the vast majority of decent, fair-paying customers. So I think the police are great, but just please don't stand around in a clump. That was always my plea to Chief De La Torre. And on the point of the booths, and your observation that there's less people in the booths. Well, the current policy is to take collectors, agents out of the booths, but they're still on the stations. And the mandate is that they should patrol around the stations, and that there is a means of raising a. As I understand it, there's a button that you can press in order to get someone to come and help you if you have a problem with your ticket. It may not work in reality. It's a while since I've been to New York. The way it works in London is where all the ticket offices were shut, so the equivalent of booths no longer exists. There is no ticket office, but those staff were redeployed to the gate lines, so they are always in the ticket hall, and you can always see them, and they're either helping customers on the barriers or at the ticket machines.
So your prescription is not to cut this staff, but to deploy them in a more proactive way.
Which is what New York is doing. But equally, though, big stick up for my former colleagues at New York City Transit. You've got to think through the risks that potentially exports to the staff. A collector agent, Mallory was her name, got horribly beaten up just the other day. She had a broken eye socket because she was beaten up. So with all of these new working arrangements, you've got to think through the risks. You've got to do a risk assessment and make sure what you're asking the staff to do does not put them in a position of risk while still maintaining customer service.
Very impressed that you're keeping up with your former colleagues in that way. I had a quick question that came in from Helsinki, Finland, before the event. This person had lived in Philadelphia most of his life, so it's not about the Helsinki transit system, which I'm sure is very good, and resists the Russians effectively. But this person said, the health benefits of the transit system workers are just gold-plated in Philadelphia, and this is offensive to me, and that's why the costs are so high. Any truth to that, Nicole? Gold-plated benefits are a big problem?
Certainly, benefits that are out of line with private sector benefits packages across major U.S. transit systems are part of the issue of uncontrolled cost. So there's a few things going on here. The effective retirement age where you can get your pension after 20 years, 22 years, 25 years, depending where you are. A lot of people retire before they're 65, so before they're eligible for government Medicare. So the transit system in many places pays for their health care from the age of 50 to 65. That is an enormous cost. If you change that so that if you retire earlier than 65, you're responsible for finding your own Obamacare plan. You're effectively also raising the retirement age, which has its merits as well. And of course, people retiring with a disability and so forth, you'd continue to pay for their plan. That is certainly something that should be considered as part of transit system cost reform. The other issue is in some places, I'm not sure Philadelphia, but it very well may be, after people have turned 65, transit system still pays their Medicare premium. That does not happen at all in the private sector. You pay your Medicare premium.
And by the way, anybody who has never been familiar with Medicare, it's not free.
Right, it's not. You pay it, it's deducted from your Social Security or your pension or your 401k. That should be another concession that management should go to the unions over. If Medicare paid by retirees is good enough for everybody else in the country, it should be good enough for the public sector workers as well. We have a long history of public sector workers mainly advocating for better benefits for themselves, which is fine. We all advocate for better benefits for ourselves, but not having the bigger conversation of what should the national safety net look like? Should it look like what we have right now? Very bifurcated, where some people get these, as your questioner says, gold-plated benefits, and some people get nothing at all. Should we be looking for a more moderate solution for everybody?
So can I just say, so I do agree that you've got to keep a lid on it, and the unions and the management both have to be responsible. The only thing I would say in defence of transit workers, of which once I was proudly one as a station foreman at Regent's Park in 1989,
Really?
is absolutely a uniform member of staff. What I would say in defence of public transit workers is that. A lot of the critics who criticize the gold-plated arrangements that they have would never dream of doing the jobs they do. The shift work, the relentless criticism, the sometimes quite dangerous working environment. So I don't begrudge transit workers a good salary and a good pension and good benefits, but I take your point that it's got to be responsible.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, these are jobs that people did when no one else was going to work in 2020.
And great conversation. This gentleman here, I'm just trying to recognize people who put up their hands first, and if we go quickly, we got about 5 more minutes. We go quickly, we get a lot of questions.
Great conversation. This is a writer. I've ridden a metro here for 30 years, and I just wonder if there was any questionnaires about why people stop riding in terms of the service. For me,
Any survey research on why they stopped?
yeah, and
riding?
I want to give an example for myself, which I'm in the minority. I don't think it had anything to do with the metro. It had to do with the other passengers and the wireless revolution. It used to be a collective quiet space I could relax in. I spent an hour a day on the metro, and I would be relaxed when I got home. Once the cell phones came in, you got to listen to somebody talking about telling his wife how to cook her pork chop next to you, or somebody with their medical problems, or 100 rings.
So no quiet car.
No quiet. I mean, it was like and now that I
I
come downtown, I do not ride the metro because I don't have to. I just find a parking spot.
So any survey research on customer attitudes? Steve, you're leaning in.
Yeah, there's loads of survey work on that. There's less litter in the vehicles now that there's no newspapers, so everybody's on their smartphone. So it cuts both ways. There's just a host of factors why there aren't folks on transit, from telework to safety to alternatives to reduced overall travel that's occurring. So there's a whole bunch of things. The other thing is, because of telework, it's more there's less congestion on the roads for commuters than there used to be, easier to find parking than it used to be, so the competitive equation has also changed.
So it's either a virtuous or a vicious circle, depending on how you define that.
One thing I would add to that
real
is
quick.
that, I mean, there's, just because that's so annoying to you, it may or may not be as annoying to the average transit rider, who frankly may not have your income, to be blunt, or may be more tolerant of it. I'm sorry?
You don't know my.
No, I don't. No, I don't. But there is a term called elite projection that Jarrett Walker has talked about a lot as a transit writer. And the point I would note is that while I've never seen any evidence of annoyance from cell phones leading fewer people to ride,
I will say I ride the higher speed rail and I choose the quiet car, so I'm happy that it's there.
Well, my point is that after the financial crisis, if you'll hold 1 second, Howard, after the financial crisis, there was evidence that the transit systems reduced service in this country because of a shortage of money, and with lower service, ridership declined. And it took years to come back in the teens, in the 2010s, and it was starting to come back then.
That's the mistake.
It's service ridership, it's the service cuts that is the big issue.
That's the mistake.
Not, I think, the cell phones.
I'm going to get this younger generation in here, right here, this young man here. Wait for the mic.
Oh, thank you
A
so much.
subjective decision on my part.
So commercial real estate developers across the U.S. are facing kind of a double whammy looming crisis with reduced in-person work and abnormally high interest rates. How will this affect how transit development moves forward in the next 12 to 24 months?
I don't know who to throw that to. Who wants to take it?
I'll take a shot at it. I don't think it'll make much difference in the next year or two. The risk of vacant commercial space in central business districts that's huge, and the prospect of declining property tax revenues in major cities and vacant urban areas is very real in some cities. Some of that will be converted to housing. Some of it will just disappear as Class C space that gets torn down, et cetera. And we'll have to see how that sorts out.
So it sounds like not as important as the work from home revolution.
No, not nearly.
Yeah.
Not nearly.
Well, we're at time, I'm afraid. And so I'm sure these panelists will love to hang around and take some impromptu questions, but let's thank our panelists and thank our audience.
Thank you.